Good evening and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening for a Daily Maverick webinar. Today's webinar is special to me not only because the topic at hand is very important and touches on issues of accountability and our rights as people live in South Africa, but it's also my first webinar with Daily Maverick. My name is Lerato Mutseda. I am a journalist with Daily Maverick. I'm a Maverick citizen journalist at Daily Maverick, and today we will be discussing the human cost of an outbreak, a fight for justice for the victims of listeriosis. Now, to unpack this topic with me will be Thamsanqa Malusi, a senior associate at Richard Spoor Incorporated Attorneys, and one of the legal firms that are responsible for a class action suit against Tiger Brands, and a man that needs no introduction, but I'll introduce her for this webinar. Mark Hayward, no stranger to the Daily Maverick team, renowned journalist, social justice and health activist, and the co-founder of Section 27 and TAC. So today we will be unpacking the listeriosis outbreak that claimed over 218 lives and infected over 1,000 people. The subsequent class action that was instituted against Tiger Brands after evidence linked the outbreak to the facility, and the new information that has emerged from that. So before we go ahead with this discussion, I would like Tammy and Mark Hayward to introduce themselves and tell the audience a little bit about yourselves. Let's start with you, Tammy.
Thank you, Lerato. My name is Tammy. I am an attorney with Richard Spoor Incorporated. I am one of the lawyers working on the class action. I've been litigating for the past 7 or so years, particularly focused on, human rights and public interest litigation. So this case falls squarely within the work that I've been interested in, but also particularly the work that the firm has been doing for a number of years now. So, yeah.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you for joining us today. Over to you, Mark.
Good evening, Lerato, and good evening to everybody who's joined us. First of all, let me congratulate you on your first Daily Maverick webinar. You're doing great. There's no need to be nervous. This is an important discussion, and I think Tammy and I are both very grateful to you and the Daily Maverick for the role that you're playing in bringing the issues to do with the listeriosis crisis back into the public domain, and hopefully putting pressure on Tiger Brands to do the right thing and to settle this case and to compensate the people that their products caused harm to back in 2017, 2018. My name's Mark Hayward, as you said. I'm basically a health and social justice activist, and I'm passionate about this issue because I've worked for 30 years around health and human rights. And although I'm not a lawyer, I ran a legal project once upon a time, a legal firm, a public interest law firm that did a lot of work, both around corporate accountability for health, concerning pharmaceutical companies and their pricing practices, but also around public responsibility and governmental responsibility to ensure the fulfillment of our constitutional right of everyone to have access to healthcare services. And what's relevant this evening probably is everyone have the right to sufficient food, but sufficient food means sufficient food that is safe, not food that is going to make you sick and kill you. So thank you for having us this evening.
Yeah, and that is the issue at hand, isn't it? That a lot of us don't really think about our food being contaminated when we go to the shops and we buy food. And it's something that we shouldn't have to think about. But in 2017 and 2018, that are all changed when the listeriosis outbreak swept through South Africa. As I mentioned earlier, 118 lives were lost. Over 1,000 people were infected. And it's been over 6 years since the NICD first linked the listeriosis outbreak to the Tiger Brands facility, Enterprise Food Facility in Polokwane. But 6 years on, the victims of the outbreak have not been compensated yet, and they're still have not been compensated yet for their suffering. So I think that's a good place for us to jump into our discussion. So it's been 6 years since the headlines were made about listeriosis, and I think a good place is to start in telling the audience what listeriosis is and how this outbreak actually came to be. Tammy, could you elucidate on that a little bit, please?
Sure. So Listeria is a bacterial infection that is caused by the Listeria monocytogenes. It is carried through food. So food that is mostly susceptible to Listeria is processed meats, such as, ready-to-eat processed meats, such as polony. And one of the reasons for that is that those products are not cooked because a lot of our food actually carry pathogens, but if you cook it, you kill the pathogen. So if you take chicken, for example, almost just about every chicken has salmonella, but if you cook the chicken to the appropriate cooking temperature, then you kill the pathogen. So with Listeria, it's like I said, it is caused by Listeria monocytogenes, and polony specifically, because it is a processed food that is ready to eat, it is susceptible to the bacteria, and it is a carrier of the pathogen. In terms of how exactly the outbreak happened, that is not entirely clear. What we do know is that when the NICD, which is the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, which is responsible for investigating the outbreak, when it went to the tiger factory, one of the things that it noted was that the state of the factory was not kept in a good condition. It was not clean. There was a lot of room for cross-contamination, which is one of the ways in which Listeria can be transferred and pathogens can be transferred. So if you're not keeping the production lines between, say, a different product from the other, it's easy for you to cross-contaminate the food. So that's one of the things that the NICD noted when it visited the Polokwane factory back in March in 2018. It didn't necessarily pin down what was the cause of how exactly the Listeria happened, but we can postulate based on what I've just said. And that is not what they were trying to do in the first place. They were trying to track the source of the outbreak and stop it. And also us as the lawyers in our case, we don't necessarily have to prove that Tiger Brands is at fault. We merely have to show that the product came from their factory, because the law, specifically the Consumer Protection Act, allows us to pin blame and claim damages on behalf of our clients from Tiger Brands on what's called strict liability, which is a no fault base claim. So the long and short of it is there's no clear indication of how exactly the the products got contaminated, but we know for a fact that they came from the Tiger Brands facility.
And I mean, this is more than just an outbreak. There are faces behind the outbreaks. There are lives that are lost. There are people that are still dealing with health issues as a result of contracting listeriosis. And both you, Tammy, and you, Mark, have immersed yourself in these cases. You know their stories. And I just want to find out from you, so we humanize the story. What are some of the cases that stood out to you that highlight the sheer impact and the sheer scale of this outbreak?
Are you asking me, Lorato, or?
Yes, you, Mark.
Okay. Well, as you said in your introduction, there were 218 deaths, recorded deaths attributed to listeriosis. It's quite possible that there were more deaths. And as you also said, there were close to 1,000 infections, recorded infections, quite possibly more, because that depends upon people reporting, it depends upon people being diagnosed, and so on. And what this case has shown is that, many of those people who were infected but didn't die suffered immensely and continue to suffer immensely. The Listeria bacteria is a very nasty bacteria, kills about 30%, I believe, of people who get infected. And it is particularly dangerous to people who have weakened immune systems, which means pregnant women, which means people living with HIV. And as we know, we have many people living with HIV in our country. And in this instance, people with HIV were particularly severely affected by listeriosis. But those are just numbers. As you said, there are human beings with dreams and hopes and aspirations and the ability to feel pain and hurt and stigma behind those numbers. I'll just highlight one. Tommy knows the clients in his case much better than I do, but back in 2018 when I was at Section 27 still, one of the people who contacted us is now the first applicant in this case, a very brave woman called Montla Ngobeni. And Montla contacted me because she had been infected with listeriosis and because her newborn baby was infected with listeriosis in utero, meaning during pregnancy. I've kept in touch with Montla ever since 2018, and I was looking back through the messages she's sent me over the years yesterday, and I hear from her 4 or 5 times a year probably, and every time Montla has sent me messages, they've been messages about the pain and suffering and about her fears for her daughter Teto and the surgery that Teto had to go through, because Teto was born with hydrocephalus, which has required brain surgery, which has required her having a shunt to take water off the brain, which has impacted on Teto's development, and which is now contributing to other problems, such as this little 6-year-old girl's ability to control her bowels. And so she's now at school, out of preschool, and with other kids of her age, and she can't control her bowels. And you can imagine, this is a really beautiful, lively, dynamic little girl whose life will be blighted forever by this. And there is absolutely no doubt, as Tami and others will explain and have started to explain, that there is no cause of this other than the fact that her mum, Montla, ate polony that was produced at this factory in Polokwane by Enterprise and by Tiger Brands. And since that, they have endured a lot of pain. It's also cost them a lot of money. Montla and her husband have had to sell their home to pay off medical bills, to pay off, I think, 700,000 Rand in medical bills. So it's a terrible human tragedy. And I don't know everybody's stories, but imagine that story being replicated in one way or another by several hundred people. And imagine the consequences for the families whose mums or dads or brothers or sisters died in 2017 or 2018 as a result of this outbreak. So it is a human tragedy, and it's a human tragedy that requires justice.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, go ahead.
No, I'll just say, just to add on what Mark is saying specifically on the using Teto as an example, as you rightly pointed out, Lerato, the outbreak affected roughly 1,000 people. And of that, we know that about half were neonates, which at the time of contracting listeriosis, these were children that were younger than 28 years old. So they contracted listeria either in utero or through birth, right? So the story that Mark tells of Teto Ngobeni is a story of roughly about 400 other children that contracted listeriosis from their mothers in utero. So children that had not even stepped into the world, that now their lives are ruined because Tiger Brands did not take the correct precautions to ensure that their foods are not contaminated with listeria. And to make things worse, they now refuse to take accountability and mitigate the risks and make the lives of these children a little bit better as a result of the reckless conduct of their reckless conduct, rather.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Yeah, it is a tragedy, and I think what also compounds the tragedy is that a lot of the people that were affected come from low-income households and are predominantly poor, and cheap foods like processed foods were the only thing that they could, were some of the only products that they could afford to sustain themselves. I just want to now move more into this listeriosis class action and the efforts Richards Boy Incorporated attorneys is putting into get justice for Monghlangobeni, Tetongobeni, and the scores of other people that were affected by this crisis. So this year, your legal firm received two important pieces of information related to the outbreak from the National Health Laboratory Services. So I just want you to go into a little bit of detail about what these pieces of information were and what they mean for the class action lawsuit.
Sure. And I think before we get to that, I think it's important to understand the case at its genesis, right? So the outbreak happened around late 2016, at the beginning of 2017. So there was a spike in the number of people reporting in hospitals with listeria infection. And it is important to note that before this outbreak, the background rate of listeria was roughly about 20 cases a year. And with this outbreak, which took roughly around 2 years, there was over 1,065 recorded cases. Our experts tells us that that number is potentially much higher than that. It's just that a lot of people probably did not have access to healthcare services for their samples to be taken for the for listeria to be proven. So when that happened back in 2016, 2017, the NICD conducted a microbiological investigation where they tested people that presented with symptoms of listeria for listeriosis. Once they had done that, they did what is called whole genome sequencing. So they try to look at the genetic fingerprint of the specific listeria that people had, and they determined that over 90% of the people that presented with listeriosis had what's called sequence type 6, so the ST6 strain of listeria. So this is over 90% of the people that contracted listeriosis during the outbreak period had the ST6 strain. What that showed was that in all likelihood, the source of the listeriosis was one place. So because if there were multiple strains that were floating around, it's possible that there were multiple sources of it. But because there was one specific strain, the hypothesis was that there's one source. Following that, they did a case control study to check what exactly is a common food item amongst the people that presented with listeriosis. Following those, they issued questions, and then what emerged was that one of the most common source food item that people reported was polony. So they then started to suspect polony as a carrier for this outbreak. It was in Jan 2018 when a bunch of kids from a creche in Pretoria presented with gastroenteritis symptoms in Baragwanath Hospital. There was about 10 children. They got tested, and then they tested positive for listeriosis. They also tested positive for the ST6 strain. The NICD then went into the creche and collected food items, including polony that was eaten by the kids. That polony tested positive for listeriosis, and it also tested positive for the ST6 strain. They then checked where exactly that polony came from. It then came out that the polony came from the Enterprise factory that belonged to Tiger Brands in Polokwane. Then in Feb, the NICD went to the factory. It took product samples. It took environmental samples. So by product samples, I meant it took products from the factory. It tested it for listeria. It took samples around the environment in the factory, and it tested it. It found the ST6 strain on the products, on the environment in the Polokwane facility. Now, the NICD has also confirmed to us that in its investigation at the time, it went around the country and it did not find the ST6 strain anywhere else in any other food producing company except for the Tiger Brands facility. Tiger Brands actually also, a month later in April, conducted its own investigation. It did its own testing, and it also confirmed that it found the ST6 strain that was responsible for the outbreak in its product. So its very own investigation confirmed the outbreak strain. When the NICD forced Tiger Brands to close its factory in March, few weeks later, the outbreak ended, which is further evidence that they were responsible for the outbreak. So the outbreak strain only came from Tiger Brands facility. It did not come from anywhere else. And as soon as they closed the factory, the numbers drastically decreased to a point where the outbreak was declared over in September. I think Mark wants to come in.
Mark?
Yes, and just to add really very briefly to what Tami said in relation to the kind of liability and I would say culpability of Tiger Brands. You know, we knew by the middle of 2017 that there was a listeriosis outbreak. It was publicized, it was announced by the Department of Health. We know what causes listeriosis, as Tami explained, the type of foodstuffs that could have been suspected. You would reasonably have expected at that point that a company like Tiger Brands would have started to do its own testing of its own manufacturing facilities. It did not do that. It took the investigation by the NICD, which only visited the factory in February of 2018 to discover the source. Tiger Brands could have discovered that much earlier because, again, as the NICD points out in its reports, when they went to the factory, they also found a factory that was unhygienic, that was not following the law when it comes to legal requirements around food production, etc., etc. So it took the NICD to join the dots, as it were, to trace the source and then to order the closure of this particular factory. And I would like to say here that we should credit the NICD for the work that the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, for the work, and the researchers who did that work. They did a very, very important public service. You could ask, however, and maybe we'll come to this later in the discussion, but I saw it was in a question that was submitted by Claire Jeffrey, why this unhygienic, risk-prone factory wasn't discovered earlier by health inspectors, because every municipality is meant to employ health inspectors, and health inspectors are meant to inspect food manufacturers and ensure that they are complying with safety standards. That's another discussion, but I just wanted to add a little bit to Tami's explanation of the genesis of this matter.
Sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think what's important, just to quickly add on what Mark just said, we estimate that for about a period of 16 months, Tiger Brands knowingly distributed contaminated foodstuffs when it could have prevented the deaths that ensued in that 6 months. Because as Mark said, it fit the profile of a company or a producer that would be potentially responsible for the outbreak. We know that the outbreak was nationwide and Tiger Brands produces nationwide. We know that it was producing foodstuffs that are susceptible to Listeria. It also knew that the outbreak was happening, but instead of testing or properly testing, it didn't do that. Instead, it continued to produce these contaminated foodstuff for a period of 16 months. And imagine how many people and how many lives would have been saved had it done the right thing, which is properly check itself and test to ensure that it was not the source of the outbreak.
100%. And this goes back to food safety practices and food safety laws in South Africa. So we've got a question from the audience, and that's one of the things I love about these live journalism webinars, is that we get to interact with audiences and they get to interact with our experts and our journalists in return. So please, guys, keep the questions coming. But the question from our page was, Mark, was that the question you read?
No, I was answering Claire Jeffrey, but I think
Claire Jeffries, oh, sorry.
pages
So,
is
apologies. So our
relevant.
page,
Yeah.
yeah, so our page said many years ago, there were health inspectors allocated to inspect food manufacturers and restaurants, hospitals, etc., and report misconduct they found. Why have these inspections stopped? That's our page's question. Thank you, our page. Can either Mark or Tammy take that?
I'm not sure if Mark can take this, but I'm not sure if those have stopped. I do know that one of the issues this was a big question when the outbreak happened, because it emerged that there was not enough inspectors, and these factories were not being inspected regularly as they should. So I don't think it necessarily stopped, or the inspectors don't inspect, but I do think that there are capacity constraints, which makes the inspecting harder, and for companies like Tiger Brands to get away with producing and supplying food in the market that is not safe for consumption. That being said, though, I don't think we should ever exonerate companies like Tiger Brands from their responsibility, that is to ensure that whatever food they produce into the market is safe for consumption, because ultimately they're the ones that make profit from the consumers. They owe a special duty of care to the consumers to ensure that whatever food they produce is safe for consumption. And the Consumer Protection Act, in fact, provides for that. It says if you produce food, it says, one, you must produce food in the market that is safe for consumption, and you must provide for adequate warning to the extent that it might not be. And if you do produce food that gets people sick, you are strictly liable for whatever loss that is occasioned by the food that you produce into the market. So as much as I think it is fair to talk about the inspectors, but I don't think that should cloud Tiger Brand's responsibility for sickening, unassuming customers.
Yeah. 100%. Thank you for that. So I just want to move on to, it's been 6 years since the evidence came out. And we often complain in South Africa that the wheels of justice are slow and that they don't serve the poor and they don't serve the majority of the population. So with all the information that has recently come out, Tiger Brands has issued a statement basically saying that they're saddened by the impact of the outbreak. They've also indicated that they're committed to ensuring a speedy resolution to the class action. Now, us as a public, we don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but you being involved in the class action, Tammy, you have an inside look into what's actually going on with the pre-trial preparations and all that. Would you say, from what you have observed, that Tiger Brands is coming to the table and actually committed to ensuring a speedy resolution, as they state?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolute nonsense. I think logic would dictate that if it's taking 6 years for you to resolve a case, right, let alone the fact that this is not even close to being resolved, if it takes 6 years to resolve a case and you're saying that you're committed to resolving it speedily, I think logic would dictate that you're not, right? It should not take that long. Tiger Brands, as I've said, the evidence is solid on Tiger Brands' liability. We didn't touch on the new evidence that has emerged, which further proves Tiger Brands' liability. But park that for now. Back in 2018 already, we had the evidence that I've just presented to you, which proved beyond any doubt that Tiger Brands was liable. Tiger Brands' own investigation proved that the strain was from their factory. They said back in 2018 already that they are committed to resolving any case that can be linked to them. Well, all the cases are linked to them because they're the only ones that produced the contaminated product. They've also said in their court papers that they admit being responsible for some cases, but not all cases. Well, if that's the case, then why are you not resolving and settling the cases that you are saying that you admit to being responsible for? All Tiger Brands has done is say a lot without saying anything, right? Which is a great legal delaying tactic because, and especially with class actions as well, because class actions are complicated, they're new in South Africa. While it's a mechanism that is great to allow a group of people to bring a case, but it's also open to exploitation for some, like what Tiger Brand is doing here in saying that we are liable to some members of the class, but we're not liable to all the members of the class. It allows them room to pretend as if they're doing something, but without saying that what exactly they're doing, right? Because if they don't specify which members of the class they are liable to, we can't say with certainty what they're liable for, right? So, and that's what.
I just want to jump in here because we're running out of a little bit of time and going into the new evidence that came up. Can you go into what the new evidence is and what it means for the class action? Does it irrefutably prove that Tiger Brands is liable? And yeah.
Sure. I mean, again, we didn't need that evidence because, like I said, whole genome sequencing proved that the S26 strain came from Tiger Brands. What the new evidence does is it's something called core genome multilocus sequence typing. Essentially, what it does, what the scientists do is they look at the ST6 cases that happened during the outbreak. So from the product, from the environment, and from the clinical samples, which is the patients, they try to compare the differences within those samples to see what's the level of difference within the ST6 strains that exist within the outbreak period. What they found is that there was not more than what they call 4 allele difference between the product, environment, and clinical samples. The NICD and our experts, and also the international expert that peer-reviewed the NICD's work, say that proves beyond any doubt that the ST6 came from exactly the same place. It's almost like saying these are identical twins, essentially. So the food samples, the environmental samples, and the case patient samples, that ST6 was identical, which proves that it came from exactly the same place. So that's the additional evidence that we've received from the NICD. And but I said though, we didn't even need to get that because the case definition was ST6 was a predominant strain that caused the outbreak, and that strain was found in Tiger Brands factory, and that was already established in 2018.
I just wanted to go into obviously now that you have all the evidence and the evidence is overwhelming. With this class action, what is Richard Spoor and LHL wanting in terms of compensation for the victims? What would be the best outcome?
Well, the best outcome would be for this case to settle tomorrow, right? Because the needs of the victims are urgent. And if you don't have intervention immediately, it only gets worse, right? So the case needs to be resolved. It needs to be resolved as urgently as possible. And settlement is entirely at the hands of Tiger Brands. What we're doing on our side is we're preparing for trial. We're sorting out a few pre-trial issues. Even trial was also delayed by Tiger Brands because back in 2019, when we certified the class action, they issued subpoenas to just about every lab in the country and every food producing company in the country to have them produce their testing results during the outbreak period, which is absurd because our class action was not against anyone else. It was directly linked to Tiger Brands and products that came from Tiger Brands. For them to go around the country to try to see if anyone else produced, to try to get testing results from everyone else was a fishing expedition. So that delayed us for about 3 years and we couldn't move on the main action because that had to be resolved first. So even on the trial front, we've had problems in getting the matter to trial because of Tiger Brands' delays. And I want to say this, Tiger Brands has no defense. They haven't put up a defense. All they've done is to deny, which is what we call a bad denial. They haven't filed expert reports. They haven't done anything that indicates any defense to the issues that we've raised. We've filed our expert reports. We've filed our papers. We're ready to go to trial, more or less. And Tiger Brands does not have an answer to our case. That's why they can only employ delay tactics and drag this matter to the detriment of the victims.
And I mean, Mark, you can come in here, or Tammy, you can take this question. I mean, is this, you said class actions are new, class action lawsuits are new in South Africa, but with cases of this magnitude, are such delays part a name of the game in terms of litigating for the human rights of others, or is this an anomaly? Have you known of a class action that has taken this long to resolve?
Before you go there, because Tommy is in a better position to answer that question
Yeah.
than me in some ways, having been involved in big class actions. But I just want to, before we leave this issue of Tiger Brand, Lorato, because I see there's a number of questions that have been asked about
I was
Tiger
gonna get, yeah.
as well. But you know, what we know is there's no question about Tiger Brand's responsibility. We know that Tiger Brands is insured for this type of event. We know that Tiger Brands basically passes the buck over to its insurer, who are, and I'm speaking here as an activist, by the way. I have to make it clear that I'm not part of the legal team. So anything that I may say that may offend Tiger Brands or the insurers comes from my own mouth and does not represent Richard Spoor Inc., etc. But the job of insurers is to try to frustrate this in every way possible. And that is what they are doing and have been doing. And they have plenty of money. The insurers are multi-billion, multinational insurers who themselves make provision for this type of thing and who, by delaying payment, actually make money from the money that should be being paid out to the victims. So the insurers and their lawyers are in fact doing a disservice to Tiger Brands. They are bringing Tiger Brands into disrepute. They are justifiably making Tiger Brands look unethical, immoral, and like a company that is not prepared to accept corporate responsibility for its behavior. As Tommy says, we trust food producers in this country. Food producers make food for 60 million of us every day. We have to believe that that food is safe, that it's not going to kill us. Tiger Brands is one of the biggest food producers in this country. It's listed as a top employer. It's considered a famous South African company. It's a member of organizations like Business Unity South Africa, which talk all the time about corporate accountability and transparency and good governance, etc. When it comes to government, what we need is for them to behave similarly. In fact, we need them to set an example that when they do something so profoundly wrong as this, they take responsibility for it, ensure compensation, mitigate and minimize the harm, and make a promise to us, the people of this country, that this will not happen again, that people won't die in future as a result of this type of misconduct and transgression. Sorry, I didn't want us to leave Tiger Brands too quickly. And yes, there was one question: can the insurers settle, or can Tiger Brands? Of course, they can. They can settle. They can settle tomorrow morning if they're listening to a program like this and they find that they have a conscience and a heart.
Yeah.
Mm.
And the questions that we've been giving,
go ahead.
Just to make it clear, Tiger Brands has all the information that we have. Every time we get medical records for clients, any information that we get from the NISD, we pass it on to Tiger Brands so that they can be able to make an informed decision on what the quantum is and what is the extent of the injuries that the people are suffering. So they are in exactly the same position as we are. They have all the information. They know exactly what they've done. They know exactly what the victims are. They know what the extent of the suffering. But they choose not to resolve the case.
And one of our audience members, Pashwane Tladi, asked a very important question. So Tiger Brands already in 2018, when the evidence was there, was refusing to accept responsibility. What makes Tiger Brands change now if they didn't accept in 2018 already? That's what Pashwane was asking.
Yeah, I mean,
Swane, sorry.
Yeah, the one thing to know, Tiger Brands has accepted that it is responsible for some cases, right? Because, like I said, it did its own investigation. It found that the outbreak strain came from its factory. So it has confirmed, it said, we are responsible for some cases. They said this in the court papers. But what they haven't said is whether or not they're responsible for the entire class. And I was saying earlier, that's a legal technicality, right? Because you're admitting liability to some extent, but without actually fully admitting liability. So we can't necessarily hold them to that they've admitted responsibility because they haven't admitted responsibility to the entire class. We've asked them in request for admission for further particulars, whether or not to define who exactly they admitting responsibility for, but yet they shift that back to us to say you should prove it. But they've also, in the same vein, delayed us, put barriers in front of us from going to court to prove who exactly they're responsible for. So yeah, so they've admitted responsibility, but they haven't admitted responsibility for the entire class.
And then Terry Mahabai asked, how can the public help to ensure that Tiger Brands doesn't get away with this? Mark, can you take that question as an activist?
Yeah, sure. And it's a very good question. We are all shareholders in Tiger Brands because I think most of us eat Tiger Brands foods, even if sometimes we don't know that we're eating Tiger Brands foods. We should find out which of those foodstuffs that we eat do belong to Tiger Brands. And we, the ordinary people, should plead to Tiger Brands. We should appeal to them to do the right thing, to show that they care, to show that actually we can continue to trust them on a day-to-day basis. And if they do not listen to the lawyers and to if they didn't see the tears of Montla and Ngobeni and others, and they do not settle this, or they do not come out with a statement in the days ahead where they say more than just passing the buck, and they make promises for speedy resolution, but without any time frames or any real commitment to a speedy resolution, then the people listening to this program should find other ways to put pressure on Tiger Brands. I'm talking to organizations like the Treatment Action Campaign, for example, about a campaign against Tiger Brands. Some people have said, shouldn't we be calling for a boycott of some of their products? Shouldn't we be calling out the CEO, Mr. Chart Kruger of Tiger Brands, and asking him what his personal responsibility? He's a fairly new CEO at Tiger Brands, but he's taken over a company that has this dark stain on it. So there's a lot that we can do. But I would appeal to people listening, because my fear is that what often happens with these companies and with this type of litigation is they squirm a little bit whilst there's this media spotlight for a few days, and then they hope that when the media goes away, it'll be back to doing very little. And that must not be the case. I think we're in early September. We should say to Tiger Brands, settle this in September, write to the lawyers, indicate a new attitude, make concrete proposals in response to their specific questions and asking for commitments, and then come back to us, the public, and say, we can genuinely say that we are embarked on a process of remedy and compensation.
Thank you, Mark. I just want to pivot back to the class action in relation to the story. I mean, the question I asked earlier, and one of the audience asked the same question. So Keegan asked, how long do you expect the civil case proceeding to take? And also, is there a nominal sum of funds roughly that you are expecting that would cover all 1,000 plus claimants? Can you take that, please, Tammy?
Yeah, it's always
Briefly,
hard
if possible.
to take with any degree of certainty how long litigation will take. It depends on when we're going to get the court date for, etc. So as I said, we're still sorting out pre-trial issues. If all goes well and there's no more interlocutory proceedings, we would hope that at some point next year, mid to late next year, we'll be in trial. But we don't need to get there because, as I've said, the evidence is overwhelming. There is a moral responsibility on Tiger Brands to intervene and intervene immediately to assist the people that need urgent help. So in terms of what the nominal sum is, the damages are individualized, even though this is a class action. So what the person is entitled to will depend on the loss and damages suffered by that individual person. So a child that was born with listeriosis, that has a VP shunt or that has cerebral palsy, their claim will be much, much higher than, say, an adult that got listeriosis and had diarrhea for 2 days and fully recovered. So the claims will be individualized. We suspect, honestly, it will be anything between 1.5 billion to 2 billion, if not more than that. We haven't fully quantified the damages yet, but that's the range that we suspect it will be as the total sum.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Tammy. Mark, I just want to go back to you here as an activist who has worked in advocacy, who has worked in cases about human rights violations. Why is it important to ensure that there's advocacy around this issue? And what is the role of impact litigation? And why need why does catalyzed action need to come from civil society?
Well, because we're talking about people's lives. Because we're talking about, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can. I wasn't sure if it's Lorato or me that's
I think it's Lorato.
Lorato. We're talking about people's lives. We're talking about people's dignity. We're talking about the trust that people necessarily put in food producers. We're talking about the trust that people have to believe that the food system is properly regulated to ensure safety and to prevent harm, particularly harm to those who are most vulnerable, like children or people who have compromised immune systems. And the advantage of litigation like this, I mean, the best thing would be for litigation like this not to have been necessary at all, frankly. It wouldn't have been necessary at all if Tiger Brands had adopted a different attitude in 2019 or 2020, but they didn't. But litigation like this helps to crystallize the questions. It helps us to gather and put the evidence out into the public domain so that the public can understand an issue that affects all of us in one way or another. And at the end of the day, hopefully litigation like this gets us justice. What I can tell you, Lorato, is that if it wasn't for Tami and Richard Sporing and the other members of the team who are working on this, there wouldn't be justice in this. None of the claimants would get any compensation, and this matter would have been brushed under the carpet, and people would have suffered without any recompense. At least in this instance, there is hope that there may be justice at some point. But more importantly, the last thing I'd say about public impact litigation is that hopefully it sets precedents and hopefully it makes us all much more aware of issues such as corporate responsibilities, the dangers that may lie in an environment, how an environment should be regulated, etc. And I think this is what this is doing. There was a question asked about food safety in general. You may come to it a little bit later, but Tiger Brands, this issue does beg bigger questions about do we know what we're putting in our mouth every day when we eat? And is the food system in South Africa sufficiently regulated? Because we should distinguish between an incident like this, where negligence led to people being poisoned and dying, and the day-to-day conduct of parts of the food industry who provide us with food without telling us that that food can contribute to heart disease, can contribute to diabetes, can contribute to obesity, etc., etc. All of us need to be more food literate, and we all need to play a greater role in monitoring our food system and insisting that our food system is properly regulated.
Thank you for that, Mark. And that links to a question that Saskia, if I can ask. How do we trust food producers in general if the extent that they cannot, the extent they can go, sorry, I'll ask that again. How do we trust food producers in general if this is the extent that they can go to avoid accountability? How can we be more vigilant as a public?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a question best placed asked to the food producers. But the one thing I'll say, which is linked to what Mark is saying, is for-profit companies naturally are motivated by money, right? They are business generating entities, money, revenue generating entities. So to make them accountable or to make them look at an issue the right way is to hat their pockets, right? So in litigation like this, if Tiger Brands produces, listeria contaminated products and nothing happens to them and they continue to make money, there's nothing that stops them in the future from doing exactly the same thing. But what they're going to respond to is if we go for them, we bankrupt them, because they are motivated by profit. And that's precise, in addition to, obviously, the main thing here is to make sure that the victims of this outbreak get properly compensated so that they can, alleviate some of the difficulties that they have. But also to that is, if we take money from Tiger Brands, it will make them think twice in the future before they get people sick, because they respond to profits and money. If you take their money away from doing something bad, they will think twice before they do that bad thing again. So that's why this is important. It's not important to compensate the victims, but it's also important as deterrent or a deterring factor for the companies themselves to check themselves before they act in this way.
Thank you, Tammy. So we have 8 minutes left. It's been a robust discussion. It flew by. So I just want to give both of you an opportunity maybe for some closing remarks before we close off the webinar. And I'd also thank you so much for explaining this with so much passion and making it very digestible. So can we start with you, Mark?
Sure. Well, again, thank you for hosting this webinar, and thank you for the people who've joined for this discussion and participated in the discussion. I think I would just like to say in closing, again, to re-emphasize that this issue of food safety, proper understanding in the public about food and risks of food is an emerging issue in South Africa and indeed in the world. Many years ago, people started to alert us to the dangers of tobacco and of alcohol and the need to do more to regulate and control those companies. We're becoming more and more aware now of the dangers of certain ultra-processed foodstuffs. And there are steps underway in this country by the government which need to be speeded up. For example, to introduce better systems for food labeling, what's called front of package labeling, so that when a person buys a foodstuff, they know if it is going to be good for them or bad for them. We also have to do more to control unethical marketing of foodstuffs. So very often, foods of very poor quality that are cheap and high in energy and carbohydrates or whatever are marketed particularly at poor people, which then contributes to disease. So there's a whole bunch of issues here that this has begun to open up. It also opens up the issue which a number of people watching have been raised, which is, are we monitoring food production carefully enough? And the bottom line there, and I accept what Tami says, he's absolutely right. The first responsibility is on the food companies. But I think, having said that, there are not enough environmental health inspectors. They are accountable to municipalities, which we know are in crisis across the country, and they do not have the budget and the resources that are needed to be able to do their job safely. So as the public, particularly the poorer parts of our public, are in danger of repeats of this listeriosis outbreak. It may not be listeriosis next time, but it could be something else that also causes harm and death. And the last thing that I'd like to say is to Tiger Brands itself. I would appeal to Tiger Brands to admit liability, to instruct its lawyers and the lawyers of the insurers to stop technical delays and legal technicalities, to settle this matter, to apologize to the people who were harmed, people who lost family members and people who are still suffering as a result of this, and to commit itself to the highest possible standard of safety in food production. If Tiger Brands could do that, then perhaps ultimately some good could come out of something which has been a terrible and ongoing human tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And you very quickly, Tammy, can you please give me your closing remarks?
Sure. I mean, I was involved in this litigation from the beginning, and I remember some of the first interviews I gave when they asked me how long do I think this will take, and I said I think 2-3 years max, on the strength of the evidence that we had back then. It is absolutely egregious that we're still here 6 years down, particularly when regard is had to the profile of the victims of this outbreak. As we've said, children, the elderly, HIV positive people, the immunocompromised, the poor. It simply is unacceptable that Tiger Brands continues to play and put up legal technicalities instead of settling this case when regard is had also to the evidence that exists. So, we thought that's why we decided to do this this campaign, because we thought we're no longer in the realm of the legalese anymore. We're in the realm of what is morally the right thing to do. We thought it right to shame Tiger. Our clients also thought it right that we should shame Tiger Brands for their appalling conduct in how they've managed this litigation. So we hope that through this and platforms like this, they will be able to, they will introspect and do the right thing.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much, Tammy, for joining me today and having this important discussion with us. I would also like to thank the audience at home for your robust discussion in the chat and your questions. And I would like to give a special thank you to our Maverick Insiders. Without you guys, Daily Maverick would not be able to do the type of journalism that we do and that holds truth, accountability to account. Thank you so much, guys. Stumbled a little bit at the end there, but yeah, it was a really nice discussion, and hopefully going forward we will see some progress in terms of the class action.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.